Today, we are diving deep into one of Asia's biggest, most ambitious, and most controversial infrastructure projects, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's a fascinating story of huge vision, unbelievable amounts of money, and some really complex geopolitics. All right, let's get into it.
Everything kicked off with this one. Just staggering number. $46 billion? That was the initial price tag they announced way back in 2015. And right away, you knew this was going to be a project on a totally monumental scale.
So what is CPEC exactly? Well, in the simplest terms, think of it as a massive network. We're talking roads, railways, energy pipelines, all designed to connect a super strategic port in southern Pakistan directly to western China. Now, what makes this so important is that it isn't just some standalone project. No, it's the flagship, the absolute crown jewel of China's much bigger global ambition, the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, to really wrap our heads around this whole thing, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at how this massive connection even came to be. Then, we'll check out its original grand design. After that, we'll explore the challenges that started popping up, the big shift in funding that followed, and finally, what the future might actually hold for CPEC.
So first up, let's unpack the origins of this whole thing. I mean, how does a $46 billion idea even get off the ground in the first place?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that the idea of linking China and Pakistan isn't new at all. It actually goes all the way back to the 1950s. But the real pieces of the puzzle only started falling into place much more recently. A huge step was finishing Gwadar Port back in 2006, and then, bam, 2015 is when it all became official. The two countries signed the agreements, locking in that massive $46 billion investment, and just like that, a decades-old dream became a very concrete plan.
So what was all that money actually for? Let's get into the corridor's grand design, because this is where you really see how it was supposed to work as this comprehensive economic strategy.
The plan was, to put it mildly, incredibly ambitious. It wasn't just one thing. First, you've got a 3,000-kilometer network of physical connections. Then, the biggest chunk of the cash, over $33 billion, was set aside for energy projects, to try and solve Pakistan's constant power shortages. But it went even further, showing a real long-term vision, creating special economic zones to kickstart industry, all of it anchored by a massively expanded Gwadar port.
And behind this huge project, you can see 2 very different sets of goals at play. For China, this was a strategic game changer. It was a way to bypass the vulnerable Strait of Malacca, get a direct foothold in the Arabian Sea, and push its global trade agenda. But for Pakistan, the hopes were a lot more immediate, fixing its crumbling infrastructure, sparking some real economic growth, and hopefully bringing in a ton of foreign investment. But, as is often the case with projects this huge, once construction got going, that grand vision started to run into some pretty harsh realities. And that brings us to part 3 of our story, the cracks that started to appear in the pavement. And a lot of those cracks, they were financial. Let's just start with this number, $1.5 billion. Now, that might not seem like a lot compared to the $46 billion total, but trust me, it was a massive red flag signaling a growing crisis.
Right, because this isn't just any old debt. This is specifically what Pakistan owes to Chinese power companies. And here's the kicker. The contracts force the government to pay for electricity capacity, even if the country didn't actually need or use the power. You can see how that created a cycle of debt that quickly became a huge burden for Pakistan.
The situation, as you can imagine, did not go unnoticed. The United States and other Western nations started raising some serious red flags. They began warning that Pakistan was basically walking right into a potential debt trap. A situation where a country can use the debt it's owed to gain strategic leverage.
But the problems weren't just about money. On the ground, things were really starting to boil over. In the resource-rich province of Balochistan, local people started protesting, saying they weren't seeing any of the benefits. This fueled a lot of unrest, and tragically even led to militant attacks targeting Chinese workers. If you add in complaints about environmental damage and a real lack of jobs for local communities, well, you've got a recipe for serious conflict.
And as if all that wasn't enough, there was another massive geopolitical roadblock: India. India strongly objects to the entire project because the route cuts right through Gilgit-Baltistan, which is a territory that India claims as its own. So, from New Delhi's point of view, CPEC is a straight-up violation of its sovereignty.
So all of these pressures, the debt, the security problems, the international objections, they all led to a really big turning point.
So let's move on to our fourth section and see how the money itself started to change.
And, a perfect symbol of this whole shift is the Main Line 1 railway project. This thing was supposed to be a vital upgrade to Pakistan's entire rail network, a real core piece of CPEC. But the project just stalled. The money simply wasn't coming through like everyone planned.
Which of course leads to the big question, why the hesitation? Why would China, the project's #1 champion, suddenly hold back on funding one of its most important parts?
Well, the answer really comes down to the financing models. See, the old model was pretty straightforward. Chinese state banks were funding government-to-government deals with very little outside oversight. But as Pakistan's debt got bigger and the risks became clearer, China started to pull back. So Pakistan turned to the Asian Development Bank, the ADB. But the ADB, they play by a completely different set of rules. They require competitive bidding, they have much stricter standards, and they demand a whole lot more transparency. The game had totally changed.
And that brings us to today, and our final section. Because CPEC is no longer just a simple partnership between two countries. Nope, it's now this complex project with multiple global players all shaping its evolving future.
So, where does everybody stand right now? Well, China's sort of recalibrating its approach, basically encouraging Pakistan to work with others to limit its own financial risk. The US is still on the sidelines, pushing for transparency. And the ADB's involvement, that really signals a new era of stricter, more conventional international oversight for any new CPEC projects.
All of this leaves Pakistan in a really tricky spot. It still desperately needs foreign money to finish these projects, but it's not just dealing with China anymore. Now it has to walk this tightrope, trying to balance the demands and conditions of multiple global lenders, all of whom have very different priorities.
And that really leaves us with the final, defining question. What started as this grand project between two partners has morphed into a complex global issue. So will CPEC ultimately become that bridge to prosperity it was always meant to be? Or will it just become a new battleground where the competing interests of global powers play out? Honestly, the answer to that is still being written.